My brother said it quietly enough that only the people immediately around him could hear. That was deliberate. Marcus had always been strategic about his cruelties. He did not make scenes. He made precise, targeted comments in tones low enough to maintain plausible deniability, high enough that the people who mattered heard them. It was a skill he had been refining since we were children, since he first understood that shame delivered quietly lands deeper than shame delivered loudly. "You're embarrassing us," he said. "Can you please just go change?" We were standing in the entryway of the Whitfield estate, which was the venue his fiancée's family had selected for the wedding, and which was exactly the kind of place it sounds like. Grand staircase, marble floors, the particular smell of old money and fresh flowers that expensive venues cultivate deliberately. 300 guests inside the main ballroom. A string quartet playing something I did not recognize. And my brother, in his rented tuxedo, looking at my dress uniform with an expression that I can only describe as the face a person makes when something they love is being ruined. I had driven 6 hours to be there. I want to be specific about that because it matters to the story. I had completed a training operation at 0400 that morning. I had not slept. I had driven 6 hours in the uniform I was wearing because there was not time to stop, and because I had not thought to pack civilian clothes, and because, if I am being completely honest, it had not occurred to me that my uniform would be a problem. It had not occurred to me because in the world I lived in, the uniform was not a problem. The uniform was what you wore. The uniform was the least interesting thing about you in the rooms where the work happened. The uniform was just the uniform. I had forgotten, in the years since I left home, that in my brother's world the uniform was something else. It was a statement. It was a class marker. It was evidence of a path that had diverged from the path the family expected, and divergence in my family was always quietly uncomfortable. I looked at Marcus. He was 34 years old. He was getting married in 45 minutes to a woman named Diane, whose family had more money than our entire extended family would accumulate across 4 generations, and he was worried about what I was wearing. "I don't have anything to change into," I said. "Then borrow something from one of the bridesmaids." "I'm not borrowing something from a bridesmaid I've never met." His jaw tightened. "Nora." He used my name the way people use names when they want to communicate that they are being very patient with someone who is failing to be reasonable. "The photographer is here. There are people from Diane's family everywhere. I cannot have you in a military uniform in these photographs." I looked at him for a long moment. 37 years. We had been siblings for 37 years. I had 4 years on him, which meant I remembered things about our shared history that he was too young to have retained. And one of the things I remembered was that this dynamic, Marcus deciding what was acceptable and presenting it as obvious, had been running since he was approximately 9 years old and had never substantially changed. What had changed was that I was no longer the person who absorbed it quietly. "I'm going to go find Mom," I said. "You should probably go greet your guests." He grabbed my arm. Not hard. Just the grip of a man who is not getting the outcome he needs from a conversation. "Nora." Quieter now. Almost pleading. "Please." I looked at his hand on my arm. Then I looked at his face. In his face I could see several things simultaneously. The genuine anxiety of a man who had organized his entire adult life around being acceptable to a certain kind of people and who is now standing in the entry of those people's preferred venue watching his older sister threaten that acceptability by existing in the wrong outfit. I could see real feeling underneath the anxiety. Real caring about the day going well. Real love for Diane, which was not complicated and which I did not begrudge him. I could also see, underneath all of that, the same thing I had always seen in Marcus's face when he looked at me in certain ways. A faint, persistent embarrassment about what I was. About the choice I had made at 18 that had taken me out of the family's narrative and into something else entirely, something that didn't fit the image he had spent his adult life constructing. I removed his hand from my arm gently. "The answer is no," I said. "I love you, and I'm glad you're getting married, and I drove 6 hours to be here. The uniform comes with me." Then I walked into the ballroom. I should tell you about my family, so that what comes next makes sense. We grew up in Connecticut. Not wealthy Connecticut, which is a different place than it sounds. We grew up in the part of Connecticut that is geographically close to wealth, but socially and economically adjacent to it, which is a different kind of proximity than actual membership. Close enough to see it clearly. Far enough away that the seeing created its own particular pressure. My father worked in facilities management. My mother worked in the administrative offices of a hospital. They were good people, hard-working people, people who had given their children what they had and had communicated, sometimes explicitly, and sometimes through the more powerful channel of implication, that the children should do better. Better, in my family's understanding of the word, meant a certain kind of visible success. A certain kind of life that was legible to the people around them as successful. A house in a neighborhood that communicated arrival. A career with a title that fit on a business card without requiring explanation. A marriage into a family that elevated rather than complicated. Marcus had pursued this map with great diligence and considerable intelligence. He had gotten himself through a good school on loans and part-time work. He had built a career in financial services that generated the income to support the life the map described. And he had found Diane, whose family's money was old enough to be elegant, whose family name opened doors in the particular Connecticut world he had always been adjacent to, and had finally found his way inside. He had worked very hard for the life he had. I respected that. I respected it genuinely, without qualification. What I did not respect was the version of me he needed me to be inside that life. The older sister, who was also respectable, also legible, also fitting neatly inside a narrative that reflected well on the family he was building. I was not that. I had joined the army at 18. My father had been cautiously supportive, my mother quietly worried, and Marcus, 14 years old at the time, had said in the particular scathing way that 14-year-olds who feel abandoned can say things. So you're just leaving. I had said yes. I was leaving. He had not entirely forgiven me for it in 20 years. Not because he was cruel, because my leaving had altered the family center of gravity in ways that he was still, 2 decades later, working around. My absence had made him the primary child, the one on whom all parental hopes were trained and from whom returns were expected. My absence had burdened him with being enough for both of us. I understood this. I had understood it for years. It did not change what I had done or what I would do again, but I understood it. What I had not understood, or had understood intellectually, without feeling it viscerally, was how much my existence continued to threaten the careful edifice he had built. How much the uniform in particular represented everything that did not fit. Everything that reminded people that he came from somewhere ordinary. Everything that could not be elegantly explained to Diane's family at the cocktail hour. I understood it now. I walked into the ballroom and took my seat and waited for the wedding to begin. The ballroom at the Whitfield estate was the kind of room that had been designed to make people feel that they were inside a painting. Tall windows along one wall looking out onto manicured grounds. Arrangements of white flowers, so dense they seemed to produce their own light. Tables set with the kind of precision that required professional intervention, that no civilian hands could have achieved, the exact alignment of silverware, the specific angle of napkins, the flowers spaced with a mathematical regularity that masqueraded as natural abundance. 300 people in that room. I found my seat, which was near the back. I noticed this without particular emotion. Near the back was appropriate. Near the back was the correct placement for the family member who had driven 6 hours in her work clothes and was not quite fitting the aesthetic. I was comfortable near the back. I had spent significant portions of my career in locations where the back was exactly where you needed to be to see the whole room. I looked at the room. To my left was a couple who introduced themselves as friends of Diane's parents. They were polite in the practiced way of people who are comfortable at events like this one, and who have long since developed the social technology for making anyone feel temporarily included without actually including them. The man asked what I did. I said I was in the army. He said, "How interesting." Then he turned to speak to someone on his other side. To my right sat an older man who had arrived slightly after me and who settled into his chair with the particular economy of movement that I associated, from professional experience, with people who had spent years moving through environments where efficiency was not an aesthetic preference, but a necessity. He was perhaps 65. Gray at the temples. His suit was good but not flashy. He wore it the way certain men wear suits, as a practical garment rather than a statement, with no apparent awareness of or interest in whether it impressed anyone. He glanced at me once, briefly, and I saw something register in his expression. Not surprise exactly. Something more like recognition, the way you recognize a word in a foreign language you once knew. He did not say anything. Neither did I. The ceremony began. The ceremony was beautiful in the careful, constructed way that expensive weddings are beautiful, every element having been selected and arranged and timed so that the overall effect resembled something organic while actually being entirely engineered. The music was right. The flowers were right. Diane came down the aisle in a dress that was clearly the result of significant investment and looked it in the best sense, not ostentatious, just exactly what it was supposed to be. Marcus cried. I had not expected that, and it affected me more than I had been prepared for. He cried when he saw Diane at the entrance, small tears that he did not try to hide and that were genuine, the unperformable product of real feeling. In that moment, he was not the brother who had grabbed my arm in the entryway. He was just a person who loved someone and was overwhelmed by it. I sat with that. I thought about the boy who had said, "So you're just leaving," when I was 18. About how much of his life, since then, had been organized around not being left. Around building a life so solid and established and embedded in a particular community that it could not be disrupted by absence. About how Diane and Diane's family and this wedding in this venue were the culmination of that project. And about how I, showing up in my uniform, was the disruption anyway. I had not intended to disrupt anything. That is important to say. I had not arrived in my uniform to make a point. I had arrived in my uniform because the uniform was what I had, and because the work was what my life was, and because the two things were not separable in the way that Marcus apparently needed them to be. But intent and effect are different things, and the effect was disruption regardless. I watched my brother cry at the sight of his bride, and I felt something complicated settle in my chest. Love for him, genuine and uncomplicated. Grief for the years of the distance between us. A tired kind of resignation about the specific form his embarrassment of me had taken today. And underneath all of it, a quiet, stubborn certainty that I was not going to apologize for existing. The ceremony continued. The vows were traditional. The ring exchange was brief. When the officiant pronounced them married, the room responded with the particular warmth of 300 people simultaneously releasing the held breath of ceremony, the collective exhale of an occasion that has gone as it should, and Marcus and Diane kissed, and the room applauded, and that was the moment. That was the moment I looked away from the altar and toward the back of the room. The man to my right was not applauding. He was sitting very still. He was looking at the front of the room, but not at the altar. He was looking slightly to the left of it, at nothing in particular, with a focused inward expression of someone who is present at an event while also being somewhere else entirely in their mind. I recognized that expression. I wore it sometimes myself. It was the expression of someone carrying something that the room was not large enough to hold. Then he became aware that I was looking at him, and he turned. For a moment we simply looked at each other. He said, very quietly, "How long?" I said, 14 years. He nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something. Branch, he said. Army. Military intelligence. Another nod. He looked back toward the front of the room for a moment. Then he said, my daughter served 8 years. She was killed in her 3rd deployment. The room around us was filled with the noise of post-ceremony movement, people standing, beginning to circulate, the string quartet transitioning to reception music. In the middle of all of that, his sentence arrived in the quiet between us with the weight that sentences like that always carry, the specific gravity of a thing that cannot be made lighter by any amount of surrounding noise. I said, I'm sorry. He said, she would have been about your age. He said it without self-pity, without performance of grief, just as a statement of fact, offered to me specifically, in the same tone he might have used to say she would have liked this music or she would have thought the flowers were too much. The matter-of-fact quality of someone who has been living with an enormous thing for long enough that the tone of voice has had to find a way to accommodate it. We did not talk more during the ceremony transition. People moved around us. We sat in our 2 chairs at the back of the ballroom while the room rearranged itself from ceremony to reception configuration, and we were quiet, and the quiet was not uncomfortable. The reception was the longer, louder version of what the ceremony had been. Tables filled. Champagne arrived. The speeches began, and the food came, and the particular social ecosystem of a large wedding established itself, the groups forming and reforming, the old friends finding each other, the family contingents occupying their territories, the general managed chaos of 300 people celebrating someone else's happiness. Marcus found me approximately 30 minutes into the reception. He had composed himself since the entryway. The anxiety was still there, somewhere beneath the surface, but he was performing host now, moving through the room with the energy of someone who has waited a long time for this day and intends to extract every possible moment from it.
He stopped beside me.
"I'm sorry," he said, "about earlier." I looked at him. "I was stressed," he said. "The thing with the photographer and Diane's aunt was already happening, and then you walked in and He stopped. Exhaled. "I'm sorry." The apology was real. I could tell. Marcus was not good at false apologies. He had never had enough patience for the performance. When he apologized, he meant it, and when he didn't mean it, he simply didn't apologize. "I know you were stressed," I said. "I'm not angry." "The uniform looks good," he said. It cost him something to say it. I could see that. "Thank you," I said. He looked at me for a moment with the complicated expression of a younger sibling who has spent 20 years working out his feelings about an older sister's choices and has not quite finished. Then he said, "I'm glad you came." "I drove 6 hours," I said. "I know." A small smile. "You always were stubborn." I said, "Get back to your wife."
He laughed.
The real laugh, not the performed one. Then he went back to Diane, and the room swallowed him. The man from the ceremony had moved to a table near the windows. I saw him when I went to find another glass of water, which I needed because the champagne was not something I could sustain through an entire reception and still drive at any point in the evening. He was sitting alone at the table, not in a lonely way, in the way of someone who had chosen temporary solitude in the middle of a crowd and was comfortable in it. He saw me notice him and gestured at the empty chair across from him with the economy of motion I had noticed before. I sat down. "You're the bride's family?"
I asked. "Her uncle," he said.
"Robert." "Nora," I said. "The groom's sister." He nodded. He looked at my uniform again, not in the appraising way, in the attentive way. "What branch of intelligence?" he said. "I'm not able to be specific," I said. "Of course." A slight inclination of his head. "I was Army myself. Before." "How long?" 31 years, he said. I did my arithmetic. 31 years with the gray in his temples and the economy of his movements. I said, "What rank when you left?" He told me. I sat with that for a moment. The rank he named was not a rank you encounter often in social settings. It was not a rank you expected to find sitting alone at a table near the windows at a Connecticut wedding with good champagne and expensive flowers. It was a rank that existed in a different conversation than the one I had imagined having. He watched me process it. He seemed to find my processing mildly amusing in a kind way. "I'm retired," he said. "I'm just Diane's Uncle Robert at this point." With respect, I said, "I don't think that's entirely accurate." He smiled. It was a quiet smile, the kind that had been doing a lot of work for a long time. "You're perceptive." "It's the job," I said. He looked at his water glass. Then at the window. Outside, the manicured grounds were lit with the particular amber light of late afternoon going into evening, and the whole scene looked like something from a catalog, beautiful and slightly unreal.
"My daughter," he said.
Her name was Christine. She was also military intelligence. I waited. "She was 29 when she died," he said. "Her third deployment. An IED outside a compound she was surveilling." He paused. "She had been recommended for a commendation. The paperwork was still in process when she was killed." I was quiet. "I think about that sometimes," he said. "The paperwork. How something that was supposed to mark what she had done arrived after she was gone, and therefore marked something different than it was supposed to." He looked at me. "It marked the gap." I said, "I'm sorry." You said that.
I mean it more now, I said.
He looked at me with an expression I recognized because I had worn it myself. The expression of someone measuring whether a stranger is actually present in a conversation or a performing presence, and arriving at a conclusion.
He said,
She would have liked you. I can tell that sort of thing. She had a quality like yours. That stillness. The capacity to hear what someone is actually saying. Something happened in my chest that I was not going to examine carefully in the middle of a wedding reception. I said, That's generous. It's accurate, he said. I'm too old to be generous at the expense of accuracy. I do not know exactly when the moment happened. The wedding receptions of the kind I was raised to observe but never quite inhabit have a natural rhythm, a series of peaks and valleys, speeches and dances and toasts, the evening building toward certain moments, and then releasing into the ordinary socializing that fills the space between them. I had been tracking this rhythm without quite being aware of tracking it. The way you track the rhythm of a room when your training has made the tracking automatic. I was standing near the bar, which had been set up in the adjoining room, when I heard my name spoken at a volume intended to carry. Not Nora. The full name. My rank followed by my last name, the way names are used in formal contexts in the military, the way my name sounded in briefings and evaluations, and the few public settings where what I did was acknowledged explicitly. Robert had said it. He had risen from his chair near the window, and he was speaking toward a small group that included Diane's parents and several of their friends and Marcus, who had been pulled into the orbit of his new in-laws, and was standing with the particular posture of a man who wants to seem like he belongs, and is most of the way there. The group turned. I turned. Robert was looking at me with the expression of a man who has made a decision. He said, Forgive me for interrupting, but I wanted to make sure that the people at this table know who they have in this room tonight. Diane's father, a man named William Hartley, who had built a commercial real estate company over 40 years and who had the particular confidence of successful men of a certain generation, looked at Robert with polite puzzlement. Robert said what I did. Not vaguely. Not in the general terms I usually offered at social occasions. He said it with the specificity of someone who understood what the specificity meant and had decided that this was the moment for it. The group was quiet. Marcus was very still. Diane's mother, standing beside her husband, looked at me with an expression that had started as social politeness and was becoming something more attentive. William Hartley said, Robert, you didn't mention. She mentioned it to me, Robert said. I recognized it. I should have brought it up earlier, but I was enjoying the conversation too much to turn it into a professional occasion. He looked at me. I hope you'll forgive the public nature of this. I said, There's nothing to forgive. William Hartley turned to look at me directly. He had the measuring gaze of a businessman, of someone who had spent 40 years assessing people for what they could offer and what they could cost, and he was applying it now. He said, How long have you been in? 14 years, I said. He said, Robert tells me your intelligence. In a general sense, I said. He says more specifically than that. He looked at Robert. Robert said, She can't be more specific than that. That's part of how you know it's real. Something shifted in the group. Not dramatically. These were not people who did things dramatically. But the arrangement of attention changed. The way people were standing changed. The specific quality of the way they were looking at me changed. Marcus was still very still. I looked at him briefly. His expression was not the one from the entryway. It was not the strategic embarrassment, the quiet correction. It was something else. Something that took me a moment to identify. He looked like someone who was understanding something for the first time that he had been in close proximity to for a long time without seeing. Diane appeared beside him. She had been moving through the room with the ease of a bride at her own reception, accepting congratulations, managing the circulating energy of 300 people who all wanted a moment with her. She arrived beside Marcus and took his hand automatically, the habitual gesture of someone who has learned the physical language of a specific person, and she looked at the small gathering around Robert and said, What's happening? William Hartley said, Robert is telling us about Marcus's sister. Diane looked at me. She had spoken to me briefly twice before this evening, once at the engagement party 8 months earlier, and once at a dinner Marcus had organized 3 months after that. Both times had been polite and brief and unremarkable in the way that social contact between the significant other's family members can be unremarkable, the exchange of pleasantries without the time or occasion for anything more. She said, "I didn't realize." I said, "There wasn't really an occasion to explain." She said, "Marcus said you were in the army." "I am in the army," I said. "He didn't say," she stopped. She looked at Marcus. Marcus said nothing. His jaw was tight in a way I recognized from childhood, the specific tension of someone who is having a private experience in a public setting and does not want the private experience visible. Robert said, to the group and to no one in particular, "The people doing the most important work are almost never the ones you'd expect to find in rooms like this. They don't tend to volunteer what they do. You have to look for it." He looked at me when he said this. I held his gaze. He said, "Christine would have liked this room too. She appreciated good flowers." I said, "I'll take that." He inclined his head. Then he picked up his glass and looked at William Hartley. "I just wanted the people at this table to know who they were sitting near tonight," he said. "That's all." Then he walked away, back toward the windows, back toward his solitude, back toward the quiet he had been occupying all evening. The rest of the reception happened around me the way the rest of things happen after a moment like that one, in the slightly altered light of a room that has shifted on its axis by some small but real degree. Diane's parents were different with me. Not effusive. They were not people who were effusive, but attentive in the specific way of people who have recategorized someone and are recalibrating their behavior accordingly. Marcus was quiet. Not the strategic quiet of someone managing a social situation. The deeper quiet of someone who is thinking. We did not speak again until near the end of the evening, when the crowd had thinned and the music had softened, and the wedding was becoming the thing it becomes in its last hour, more personal, more intimate, the people who remained being the ones who genuinely wanted to stay rather than the ones who felt obligated.
He found me near the door to the garden.
I had stepped outside for a few minutes because the evening air was good, and because I had been inside for 5 hours, and because sometimes you need to breathe. He came outside and stood beside me. The grounds at night were lit softly. The same amber light, coming from a different angle now, the event lights rather than the afternoon sun. Somewhere inside, the string quartet was playing something slow. Marcus said, "I didn't know Robert was Christine's father." I said, "I didn't know at first either." "He told me," Marcus said, "after. He came and found me and told me." I waited. He said, Marcus stopped. "Tried again. He said that his daughter had a quality like yours. That he recognized it." I did not say anything. "I didn't know," Marcus said. And the way he said it carried more weight than the 3 words could technically bear. He did not mean he didn't know about Robert or about Christine. He meant something larger, more cumulative. The specific not knowing of someone who has been in proximity to something their whole life and has not looked at it carefully enough to see it. I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I'm sorry about the entryway." "You already apologize." "I know." He looked out at the grounds. "I'm apologizing for more than the entryway." I looked at him. In the soft lighting of the garden, he looked younger than he had all day, less polished. The performance of the groom at his own wedding had come down a few degrees in the quiet of the evening air. He said, "You came back for every important thing. Even when I didn't make it easy. You came back." I said, "You're my brother." He said, "I know, but you didn't have to. And I made it harder than I should have." We stood there for a while in the garden of the Whitfield estate with the music coming softly from inside, and the grounds lit in amber, and the evening air doing what October evening air does in Connecticut, which is to say cooling quickly and carrying with it the specific smell of autumn that is different from any other smell, and that means something different depending on where your life has put you when you encounter it. I thought about Christine, about the paperwork that arrived after she was gone, about Robert sitting near the window with his quiet grief and his accurate observations and his recognition of something in me that he had been looking for in another face for years. I thought about Marcus at 14 saying, "So you're just leaving." I thought about what 14 years looked like from inside them and what they probably looked like from outside, from the vantage of a younger brother who had stayed while his sister went. I said, "The uniform goes where I go, Marcus. It's not separate from me." He said, "I know that now." You knew it before, I said. You just needed today to feel it.
He thought about that.
Yeah, he said. I think that's right. We went back inside. The music was still playing. Diane was on the dance floor with her father, and the look on her face was the uncomplicated happiness of someone in the right place at the right moment. And watching it, I felt something uncomplicated myself, which was gladness. Gladness for my brother who had cried at the sight of her in the doorway. Gladness for the day happening at all. Gladness even for the entryway conversation, because without it the evening would not have taken the shape it did. Marcus went to Diane and took her hand, and they danced together, and I watched from the edge of the dance floor with my glass of water and my dress uniform that had arrived uninvited and stayed anyway. I found Robert near the exit, preparing to leave. He was pulling on his coat with the careful movements of a man who had been standing for too long and whose body was registering the hours. I said, "Thank you." He looked at me. "For what?" "For saying what you said." He considered this. "I didn't say it for you," he said. "Not only for you." I nodded. "Christine never got the room understanding what she had done," he said. "She died before the paperwork arrived and before any of the people who didn't know had a chance to learn." He buttoned his coat. "I've been in a lot of rooms since then. I say something when I see it. It's the best I can do." I said, "It's enough." He looked at me steadily. "Take care of yourself," he said. "The work asks a lot. Make sure you're keeping enough for the rest of it." It was the thing that people who have done the work say to people who are doing the work. The specific advice that cannot be fully understood by anyone who has not been inside the particular demands of a career like this one. I received it the way it was offered, as something real from someone who had earned the right to say it. "I will," I said. He nodded once. Then he walked out into the Connecticut autumn, and the door closed behind him, and I stood in the foyer of the Whitfield estate in my dress uniform with the music still going inside and thought about Christine, who would have been about my age, who had a quality like mine, who liked good flowers. I thought about the paperwork that arrived after she was gone. I thought about the 14 years I had been doing the work while the rooms I came from had not known what they were looking at. I thought about Robert sitting near the window all evening, carrying his daughter's absence in the particular patient way of someone who has been carrying it long enough to know how. And I thought, this is why you keep going back. Not because the rooms are easy, not because the rooms always know what they are looking at, but because the work matters and the people matter, and the going back is its own form of insistence that the connection, however complicated, however imperfect, is worth the insisting. My brother was in there, dancing with his wife on the night of his wedding, having cried at the sight of her in the doorway in a way that could not be performed. He was worth the 6-hour drive. He was worth the uniform staying on. He was worth, when it came to it, every difficult thing that had ever passed between us across 37 years of being related to each other. I went back inside. I found my seat near the back, and I stayed until the music stopped. There is something I want to say to you before this ends. If you have ever been made to feel like what you are is an inconvenience, if you have ever stood in a doorway and been told, by someone who should have been glad to see you, that your presence is the wrong kind of presence, if you have ever driven 6 hours to be somewhere and been met with "please change," rather than "I'm glad you came," I want to tell you something about what to do with that. You wear the uniform. I do not mean that literally, though if the literal version applies to you, then yes, literally. I mean it in the broader sense. The thing you have built, the years you have accumulated, the work you have done in the spaces no one was watching, the specific, unglamorous, irreplaceable substance of who you actually are. You do not take it off for the room. The room will catch up eventually. It may take a Robert to facilitate the catching up. It may take an evening that unfolds in ways no one planned. It may take longer than it should and arrive in a more complicated form than you imagined. But the room catches up. And when it does, you want to be standing in the thing you actually are, not in borrowed clothes that fit the room's expectations but not your life. The uniform goes where you go. It is not separate from you. And on the day the room finally sees it clearly, you will be very glad you did not leave it in the car. Thank you for spending this evening with me. If something in this story reached you, I would love to hear where you are tonight and what part of it stayed with you. And if you have ever been told you were embarrassing someone simply by being what you are, I hope you hear this. You were not the embarrassment. You were the thing they hadn't learned to see yet. There is a difference. Stay with us. There are more stories to tell. I want to go back to something I skipped over, to the years between 18 and the wedding. Because the wedding was not the first time Marcus had asked me to be different than I was, and understanding that history is what gives the wedding its actual weight. When I was 22, I came home on leave for the first time. For years in, I had completed my basic training, my additional intelligence training, and my first posting, which had been stateside but demanding in ways I was not yet able to fully articulate. I came home for Christmas. My mother made the dinner she always made. My father asked careful questions. Marcus, 18 by then and starting college, looked at me across the table with the watchful eyes of someone trying to understand a person who had become difficult to categorize. He said, "Do you like it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "But you can't really talk about it." I said, "Not most of it." He said, "That seems lonely." It was the most perceptive thing he had said to me in years. I looked at him with more attention than I had given him in a while and saw in his face something I had not expected. Genuine concern, not judgment. Not the managing embarrassment I had encountered from him before and would encounter from him again. Just the straightforward worry of a younger sibling who does not understand his older sister's life, but is not sure the life is good for her. I said, "It's not lonely in the way you mean." He said, "What way do I mean?" I thought about how to explain it. I said, "You're thinking of lonely as in isolated, as in being far from people. But the work puts me near people constantly, near people who are doing something real. The loneliness I have is different. It's more about not being able to bring what's real back into the rooms where it might matter." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Like this room?" I said, "Yes, like this room." He nodded slowly. I do not know what he did with that conversation. It did not seem to substantially change anything. The years proceeded the way years proceed when two people live in different worlds, with the intermittent contact of holidays and phone calls, and the gradual accumulation of distance that is not hostility, but is also not closeness. He went through college. He started his career. He met Diane. He built the life on the map. And every time I came home, some version of the same dynamic asserted itself. My presence was slightly awkward. My life was difficult to explain. My accomplishments existed in a register that the room did not have the vocabulary for. The conversation organized itself around what could be easily talked about, and I was consistently not the easily talked about thing. I had learned to be fine with this. Or I had learned to appear fine with it, which is the same as being fine with it from the outside and considerably different from the inside. What I had not learned, until the wedding, was that Marcus had been aware of this dynamic for years and had been navigating it in his own way, which was to lean into what was explainable at the expense of what was not. To build a life where I fit as background and Diane fit as center, and to make peace with that arrangement because the alternative was too complicated. And then Robert had stood up at the table near the windows. And the alternative turned out to be available after all. There is something that happens to families when one member does something that takes them outside the common frame of reference. It is not always what it looks like from inside the experience. From inside, the going away feels like the most natural thing. You go toward what is right for you. You go toward the work that fits. The going feels like moving forward because it is moving forward. You are not thinking about what you are leaving or what the leaving costs the people behind you.
They're thinking about it.
What I understood only gradually over the 14 years between enlisting and standing in the entryway of the Whitfield estate was that my going had cost my family something specific. Not my parents, who had found a way to hold pride and worry in a balance that worked for them, but Marcus, who had been 14 when I left and who had carried the full weight of the remaining child for the year since. The remaining child. That is not a phrase I invented. It is a real dynamic, studied and documented, the particular pressure that descends on the sibling who stays when one sibling goes. The expectations concentrate. The attention concentrates. The hopes concentrate. And the remaining child either rises to this or buckles under it, and usually does some complicated mixture of both. Marcus had largely risen to it. He had built the life. He had achieved the things. He had done the work of becoming the person he became. But he had also carried, somewhere underneath all of that achievement, the specific weight of having to be enough for both of us. Of having to fill the space I had vacated. of being the one who was present for every holiday, every crisis, every ordinary family moment, while I was wherever I was, doing whatever I was doing, which was important and real, and which no one at home fully understood. I had not seen this clearly until the wedding, until he grabbed my arm in the entryway, and I saw in his face not just the anxiety about the aesthetic, but the accumulated weight of years of being the one who stayed, and the one who made it work, and the one who was there when I was not. I had been the absent one, and absence has costs that the absent person does not always see, because they are not there to see them. This does not mean I should have stayed. I do not believe that. I believe the work I went to do mattered, and that going was right. But understanding the cost is different from justifying the going, and the cost was real, and Marcus had been carrying part of it for 20 years. The entryway was not really about the uniform. The uniform was the occasion. The content was the 20 years. I understood this only in the garden later, when he said I'm apologizing for more than the entryway, and something in the honesty of it unlocked the context that the apology was sitting inside. He was apologizing for 20 years of asking me to fit a frame that did not fit me. I was forgiving him for 20 years of not understanding what he was asking. Neither of us said this explicitly, but it was what was happening in the garden in the October night air, while the music came softly from inside, and the grounds were lit amber, and the wedding was becoming the thing a wedding becomes when the formal part is over and the real part begins. I think about Christine sometimes. Not often. I am not the kind of person who dwells on things they cannot change, which is a survival mechanism that the work requires and which has become, over 14 years, an actual characteristic of how I am rather than a performance of how I should be. But sometimes, I think about the paperwork that arrived after she was gone, about the commendation that was supposed to mark what she had done and instead marked the gap between what she had done and when the marking arrived. I think about how that specific form of missed timing is its own particular grief. Not the grief of the loss, which is larger and older and more fundamental, but the smaller grief within it, the grief of recognition that did not make it in time. I think about that gap. And I think about what Robert had done at the table near the windows. He had decided that he was not going to let the gap happen in every room he entered for the rest of his life. That he was going to say something when he saw something. That the recognition was going to arrive when the person was still there to receive it, because he knew better than almost anyone what it looked like when it did not. He had given me something in that room that I had not asked for, and had not known I needed until I was holding it. He had said, "Here is what this person has done. Here is what it means. Here is why the room should know." He had filled the gap. I had spent 14 years being comfortable with the gap.
With the room not knowing.
With the work existing in a register that the rooms I came from could not access. I had built my equanimity around that comfort, around the understanding that the work did not need the room's recognition to be real. And that is still true. The work is real regardless. The years are real regardless. But Robert had shown me something else. He had shown me that the recognition, when it finally arrives, is not nothing. That the room knowing is not a vanity. That the specific feeling of being seen in the thing you have actually built, in the presence of the people who should have been seeing it all along, is not something you can dismiss as unnecessary just because you have learned to manage without it. I had managed without it for a long time. That did not mean it didn't matter when it came. I drove home the next morning. Not immediately after the wedding. I stayed at a hotel nearby, because the 6 hours back was more than I wanted to manage on the same night. I slept for longer than I had in several weeks, which tells you something about the specific form of exhaustion the day had produced. In the morning I had breakfast alone in the hotel dining room and drank 2 cups of coffee and looked out the window at the Connecticut morning, which was the specific gray gold of late October, the light coming through the leaves that were still on the trees and laying a kind of amber filter over everything that made it look like a different version of the evening before. I thought about the whole day, not in a complicated way. Just moved through it in my memory the way you move through a day that has had more in it than expected. The entryway.
The ceremony.
Robert. Christine's name in the quiet between us. His rank, which I was still adjusting to in retrospect. The small gathering at the table, and what he had said. Marcus in the garden. The apology that was about more than the entryway. Diane on the dance floor with her father. The amber light. I thought about what the day had cost and what it had given. The cost was the familiar cost of going back. The re-entry into a world that did not fully know you, and the specific kind of effort it takes to be present in that world without either performing yourself into something you are not or retreating into the silence that is easier, but also lonelier. The giving was more complicated to name. Something had shifted between me and Marcus. Not resolved, not concluded, but shifted in the small and real way that things shift when two people have a genuine conversation in the dark instead of a managed exchange in the light. He had said I'm apologizing for more than the entryway, and I had heard it, and something between us had moved. That was something. Robert had filled the gap. Not for Christine, who could not have it filled, but for the other people in the room, for me, for the principle of it, for the thing he had decided he was going to do with the remaining years and the rooms he still entered. That was something larger. I finished my coffee. I left the hotel. I drove the 6 hours back in the early morning with the Connecticut autumn giving way to the mid-Atlantic fall, the landscape changing in the subtle way it changes when you cross the invisible line from one region into another. I was back at the base by early afternoon. I changed out of the dress uniform. I went to work. The work was still there, ongoing, making its usual demands, operating in its usual register of precision and consequence, and the particular satisfaction of doing the right thing in the conditions that require it. I sat down. I started. The day before had been real. What it gave was real. What it cost was real. The accumulation of 14 years behind it was real. And the work coming next was real. That was enough. That has always been enough. And it will be enough for as long as I keep doing it.